The impact of the petroleum industry in China has been increasing globally, as China is forecast to overtake the U.S. as the world's biggest crude importer in 2016, and since 2012, has been the fourth greatest oil producer in the world, surpassing the United States. According to the Energy Information Administration, China first became the world's largest net importer of petroleum and other liquids by the end of 2013. In 2009, China completed its first critical oil pipeline, the Atyrau-Alashankou oil pipeline in Central Asia, as part of a larger overall trade expansion with the Central Asian region, which represented a trade volume of over $50 billion by 2013, up from $1 billion in 2000. The Economist reported as recently as January 13, 2016 that China imported a record 6.7 barrels a day of oil in 2015. They also reported that, as in the United States, China's storage tanks seem to be full, with ships carrying oil spotted waiting at anchor out at sea. Current. A big role is played in China's oil endowment by its state-owned oil companies, mainly China National Offshore Oil Corporation, China National Petroleum Corporation, China National Refinery Corp., and Sinopec. According to CNOOC's 2014 annual report, from January 2013 to December 2014, CNOOC's produced 68.68 million tons of crude oil. State-owned CNOOC, with headquarters in Beijing, the largest offshore oil and gas producer in China. CNOOC has been actively engaged in the development of the new One Belt, One Road New Silk Road project designed to improve trade and transport links in Asia. In 2013, the pace of China's economic growth exceeded the domestic oil capacity, and floods damaged the nation's oil fields in the middle of the year. Consequently, China imported oil to compensate for the supply reduction and surpassed the U.S. in September 2013 to become the world's largest importer of oil. Oil drilling platforms. The largest oil field in the South China Sea, the Liuhua 11-1 field, located 210 kilometers southeast of Hong Kong in the Pearl River mouth basin offshore South China, was discovered by American BP in January 1987 in Typhoon Alley. Water depth. The presence of heavy oil and a very strong bottom water drive were among the technical challenges that had to be resolved before the oil could be extracted. Amoco and Nanhai East engineering teams experimented with offshore drilling techniques, floating production, storage and offloading system that would have drilling and production support. By 2008, the FPSO had equipment capable of handling 65,000 barrels of oil and 300,000 barrels of total fluids per day, and it would be loaded and shipped by shuttle tankers. China's $1 billion oil drilling rig, the Haiyang Shiyu 981, owned and operated by the China National Offshore Oil Corporation in the South China Sea. Ocean Oil 981 began its first drilling operations in 2012. Its location is contested. Energy security. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. China has one of the world's largest strategic oil reserves. Global Strategic Petroleum Reserves refer to stockpiles of crude oil held by countries for national security during an energy crisis, according to a 2007 article in China News. At that time, China's expanded reserve would include both mandated commercial reserves and state-controlled reserves, and would be implemented in 3 stages to be completed by 2011. The state-controlled reserves Phase 1 consisted of a 101,900,000 barrels reserve to be completed by the end of 2008. The second phase of the government-controlled reserves with an additional 170 million barrels was to be completed by 2011. In 2009, Zhang Guobao, head of the National Energy Administration, announced the third phase that would expand reserves by 204 million barrels with the goal of increasing China's SPR to 90 days of supply by 2020. The planned state reserves of 475,900,000 barrels together with the planned enterprise reserves of 209,440,000 barrels will provide around 90 days of consumption, or a total of 684,340,000 barrels. History. Early history. Before 1937, Chinese oil production was measured in quartz and, in its crude condition, was used solely as a lubricant. This first well, developed under the most primitive of conditions and with relatively untrained personnel, began to produce over 20 barrels of oil a day. In time, with equipment brought in from Sichuan and elsewhere and the development of several distillation plants, 9 more wells were drilled in the immediate area. A letter from my father to T. E. Mobley of Standard Vacuum in June 1942 reported that the Yumen wells then had a capacity of about 1,000 barrels of oil and 10,000 gallons of gasoline a day, except in winter when cold weather caused the oil to congeal. This was the first major oil field in China. In 1956, a rail link was built to Lanzhou. Until then, the oil was transported out by truck. A pipeline was constructed in 1957. The Yumen refinery was enlarged and modernized, and by the late 1960s it was reported that production from that area was about 2 million tons. Imports. By 2014, China was importing approximately 7 million barrels of oil per day. 3 state-owned oil companies, Sinopec, CNPC, and CNOOC, dominate its domestic market. The energy policy of China is a policy decided on by the central government with regard to energy and energy resources. Ensuring adequate energy supply to sustain economic growth has been a core concern of the Chinese government since 1949. According to a 1987 study, prior to the 1950s, China imported all its oil. In 1959, large reserves were discovered in Songhua Jiangliao Basin in northeast China. The Daking oil field in Heilongjiang. Although China is still a major crude oil producer, it became an oil importer in the 1990s. China became dependent on imported oil for the first time in its history in 1993 due to demand rising faster than domestic production. In 2002, annual crude petroleum production was 1,298,000,000 barrels, and annual crude petroleum consumption was 1,670,000,000 barrels. In 2006, it imported 145 million tons of crude oil, accounting for 47% of its total oil consumption. By 2008, much of China's oil imports derived largely from Southeast Asia, but its growing demand forced it to import oil from all over the globe. Exports. According to a 2005 study, in 1973, as production increased, China began exporting crude oil to Japan, and began offshore exploration. Exports increased to 20 million tons in 1985, before internal consumption began increasing faster than production. By 1993, internal demand for oil exceeded domestic production, and China became became a net oil importer. Domestic production in 2002, annual crude petroleum production was 1,298,000,000 barrels. By 2009, China's oil supply was 4,855 terawatt-hours, which represented 10% of the world's supply. Province started producing in 1960, and by 1963 was producing nearly 2.3 million tons of oil. Production from Daking declined, but in 1965, oil fields in Shangli, Shandong, Dagang, and Tianjin yielded enough oil to nearly eliminate the need of importing crude oil. In 2002, annual crude petroleum production was 1,298,000,000 barrels, and annual crude petroleum consumption was 1,670,000,000 barrels. According to a 2008 study, although Chinese crude oil production continued to increase rapidly since the 1970s, by 2012 China was the world's fourth greatest oil producer. Since 1993, China was a net importer of petroleum. As of 2012, China was the world's second-largest oil-consuming nation and second-largest oil-importing nation, second in both only to the United States. In 2008, China had a growing population of over 1.3 billion people and relied on other states for resources, such as oil. The Chinese government is taking diplomatic action to improve the relationship with ASEAN states. According to a 2008 report, the Chinese government had to take extra strides to secure good relationships with its neighbors. Malaysia is a neighbor state that was often seen as in contention with China because of political differences. Yet the relationship with Malaysia was symbiotic because of the large supply of oil and the need for security assurances from China. In 2008, Malaysia was the #1 producer of petroleum in the South China Sea, and they account for over one-half of the production in the region, according to a 2005 article in Washington Post. China's oil relationship with other countries shifted from that of a world exporter to that of a world importer. This shift to dependence on foreign oil has changed the exploration and acquisition policies of China. China's oil need overwhelmed its internal capabilities. According to an article published in 2005, oil acquisition was a process of investment in foreign lands and the creation of an internal oil reserve in case of emergency. According to a 2008 article, China took steps to alter its security policies in places in the world that were rich in oil. By 2008, China National Petroleum Corporation had invested in producing, marketing, and supplying oil in China. According to a 2005 study, this company supports internal sources of oil production and reserves. By 2004, China was investing in its first national oil reserve base to avoid foreign dependence. There are 3 different provinces in which they are focusing. The first, Zhoushan, Zhejiang Province, was built by Sinopec, China's largest oil refining company. The storage space is 5.2 million cubic meters, says the National Development and Reform Commission. Zhejiang was originally a commercial oil transfer base. Its coastal position makes it convenient for movement purposes, although it is at the same time vulnerable to offshore violence. The next reserve of interest in Guangdao, Qingdao, Shandong Province, and the final Dalian, Liaoning Province. All of these reserves are coastal, and with the creation comes vulnerability to possible coastal attacks. These stockpiling strategies, as well as the international acquisition companies, have state-run initiatives to combat supply disruption. In 1993, China projected that these stockpiling sites would be filled and provide for 90 days of oil. This goal, however, is yet to be fulfilled. In 2005, China began to take drastic measures with its internal oil reserve programs, as domestic oil production in China supplied only two-thirds of its needs, and the estimated consumption requirement by 2020 was about 600 million tons of crude oil. Along with an emphasis on defensive oil stocks, there is a significant push to create an offensive oil acquisition program. By 2007, the oil stocks and offshore reserves have tidewater access. It is also a weakness because, as mentioned before, the stocks and reserves are not protected by land. In 2007, United Press international journalist questioned energy security, as all three of the stock oil bases were within range of Taiwanese cruise missile attacks. In 2004, China had to import 100 million tons of crude oil to supply its energy demand, more than half of which came from the Middle East. China's oil output was far lower than its domestic need, as its growing economy demanded greater and greater amounts of crude oil every year. It is a possibility that high oil prices could quell global economic growth in China. This is one of the reasons why it no longer exports oil to Japan, who formerly depended heavily on Chinese oil. They had major disagreements on prices, and China decided to cease the trade agreement. China is attempting to secure its future oil share and establish deals with other countries. Chinese President Hu Jintao has proposed to build a pipeline from Russian oil fields to support China's markets, as well as other billion-dollar arrangements with Russia, Central Asia, and Burma. By 2008, China owned less than 1% of the oil company BP, worth about $1.97 billion. China's oil industry is dominated by its state-owned oil companies, in particular three major players: China National Offshore Oil Corp., China National Petroleum Corp., and Sinopec. In 2004, these companies had largely invested in exploration and development in countries that had oil fields but do not have funds or technology to develop them. In 2004, CNOOC signed a deal to extract 1 million barrels of oil a day in Indonesia, as well as other projects with Australia. In addition, an oil reserve that would theoretically fill with 30 days' worth of oil has begun construction in China. However, their oil policy on the world oil market was not completely clear as to how they would deal with the situation as a whole. According to an article published in 2006 by the Carnegie Endowment, as China's economy increased 7 times between 1980 and 2004, and its total energy consumption merely doubled. In order to obtain oil, China had to import from states that can be considered unstable. China's need for oil may outweigh the costs of importing from a conflict-laden Middle East. China is striving to diversify their energy sector by seeking imports from other regions of the world and by starting alternative energy programs, such as nuclear. As reported in 2011, as of 2010, China consumed 455 million tons oil, of which over 200 million tons were imported. China's oil demand was expected to increase by 6% in 2011, according to Petroleum.